So the question that I'm supposed to answer today is, can Asia guide Biden on China? If this was a question in a multiple choice exam, the correct answer is yes. And then I should now sit down and say, okay, answer given. But I will elaborate a bit on my answer and actually emphasize as strongly as I can that Asia can and Asia should guide Biden on China. And why is that the case? I would give three reasons. One is, of course, the most important thing to acknowledge is that President Joe Biden is actually a very nice guy. I'm afraid I've never had the pleasure of meeting him in person, but many of my good friends are good friends of his. And they all assure me that he's a remarkable gentleman. And if you look at his career, clearly he's got very high ethical standards, and it's always trying to do the right thing for the United States of America. And he's also surrounded, as you know, by equally good people. Some of them actually I do know in person. And you can tell that what they're trying to do is the right thing. They're not trying to do the wrong thing. They're trying to see what is good for United States, what's good for China, and they believe that they are on the right mission. But of course, and this is to be, of course, the second point I'm going to make is that unfortunately, they are on a wrong mission, a wrong course with China. And of course, the best evidence of this is that they are carrying on with Trump's policies on China in many ways. And here, I think the reason why I want to emphasize this point. The reason why we in Asia should help Biden succeed is that if Biden fails, Trump can come back. I want to emphasize that. He got 75 million votes. And the second term Trump will be very destructive. I mean, it'll be destructive for the United States, but it'll be disruptive and destructive for Asia, and frankly, disruptive for the world too. So for that, just to for the sake of preventing the return of Trump, we should try to help Biden succeed. But my second point is that to help Biden succeed, we have to actually explain to him in using rational language and arguments that are inherited from Western thought, Western reasoning, and explain why what the US is doing vis-a-vis China is wrong. Not just wrong for China, by the way, also wrong for America and bad for America's interests. And of course, we in Asia, we will suffer if things go badly. We are in the front line. I mean, the whole US-China contest will be played out in Asia. So we are in the front line. We will suffer. And that's the second reason why we should guide Biden on China. And the third reason, of course, is that, frankly, if you look ahead, and if you look at Asia's history over the last 200 years, clearly, for most Asians, this is the most promising time in Asian history. If the past, as I said, the past 30 to 40 years have been the best years for Asia, the next 30 to 40 years will be absolutely amazing. So just as we are about to enter into one of the most promising eras of human history, we can be disrupted by this US-China contest. And that's why we have a lot to lose if these things go wrong. And that's why we must clearly speak out. And that's why I was very happy to accept your invitation today to join you. So the big next question is, how do we help Biden? What do we do? And I would say there are three ways in which we can help Biden. And the first one, the most obvious one, is to try and explain as simply, logically, reasonably why the current course with China is wrong. And it is wrong for a very simple reason. The Biden administration, which has inherited the policies of the Trump administration, has not worked out a strategy on to deal with China. Just ask yourself a very simple question. Before you work out a strategy, you got to work out your strategic goals. And you ask yourself a simple question. What are the goals that the Trump administration was trying to accomplish with China? And what are the goals that the Biden administration is trying to accomplish with China? And the answer is zero. You can't, there's no answer. There's no clear answer. And I give you, hypothetically could be, I give you the following, okay? Number one, United States may be trying to stop China from becoming the number one economy in the world. Is that the goal? If that's the goal, it's going to fail. Definitely fail. Because nothing can stop the return of China. Nothing we have no moral right to deprive the Chinese people of their right to improve their standard of living, improve their quality of life. And if they improve their standard, improve their quality of life, they will get a bigger economy. Their per capita income will go up, right? So is that what the United States is trying to do? Stop China's economy from becoming number one? And by the way, Joe Biden said something very revealing in passing. He said, China wants to be number one. It ain't gonna happen on my watch. He's right. If Joe Biden is only president for 4 years, it will not happen in 4 years. Within 8, 10, 12, it doesn't matter when, it will happen. So that's an impossible goal. One. The second goal may be to overthrow the Communist Party of China. And this is, of course, hinted at and in the remarks made by Mike Pompeo, former Vice President Mike Pence. And is that the goal again? It won't work. The Communist Party of China is one of the strongest political parties in the world. It has achieved so much. And even the Harvard Kennedy School study has shown how support for the Communist Party of China has gone up from 86% in 2003 to 93% in 2016. And this is a very credible academic study that's documented this. And so if that's the goal, it also is not going to happen. Maybe the third goal is to contain China, like the United States successfully contained Soviet Union, cut off China's influence in the world. That too will fail. In fact, China today is more integrated into the global economy than the United States is. Now you can see that if these are the three potential goals of either the United States or the Biden administration or the previous Trump administration or the strategic thinkers of the United States, they cannot succeed. And so this is quite remarkable. The United States is by far the most successful society we have seen in human history. Frankly, no other society has achieved as much as the United States has. Even to today, no other society has sent a man to the moon, right? The United States has done it. It's a remarkable society. It has the best universities in the world, some of the best think tanks in the world, some of the leading minds in the world. But amazingly, this society has not been able to work out a coherent, credible strategy on how to deal with China. And let me mention in passing also that one reason why I say this with confidence is that at a one-on-one lunch I had, Mr. C.H. Tong, with your friend Henry Kissinger in 3 years ago in 2018, he actually told me that the United States doesn't have a strategy. And that's why you notice, for me, actually, one of the leading indicators that we are now entering difficult times is the fact that Dr. Henry Kissinger, who's normally very cautious, doesn't say very much. But for him to say publicly that, hey, are we on the verge of another World War I situation? Now, that's a very strong warning. That warning is an indicator that we are entering very difficult and dangerous waters in US and China. And that's why we need to speak out in Asia and explain that none of the things that the United States is doing with China today are working, and they will not work. And look, for example, let me just mention this, okay? What is the main instrument that the Trump administration used against China, and which sadly is being carried on by the Biden administration? That's the trade war, right? They imposed tariffs, sanctions on China. And, I was at a panel recently speaking at the Harvard Asia Annual Conference, and two very distinguished Harvard professors were there. And when we were discussing this trade war and it hadn't worked, so I said, why doesn't the Biden administration just stop, remove the trade and tariffs, right? And the answer given by a senior member of the Biden administration was that, hey, we cannot use the tariff, we cannot remove the tariffs because we need them as bargaining chips against China. And one Harvard professor very wisely said, well, that's like telling China that if you don't listen to me, I'll shoot myself in the foot again. The trade tariffs have hurt American consumers, have hurt American workers, have hurt the American economy, and haven't damaged China, right? So clearly, if the United States was a reasonable, logical actor on the global stage, it would just get rid of this tariffs and sanctions, but it's not possible to do so. And the fact that it's not possible to do so indicates how strong the anti-China sentiment has become in the American body politic. And so even that's something that is by any Western standards of reasoning, that trade tariffs and sanctions should be removed, they cannot be removed because of the strong anti-China sentiment in the American body politic. So that's why, frankly, that is actually one of the most important reasons why we in Asia need to speak out, because Biden is boxed in. Even though I'm sure privately he realizes, it privately, that these actions against China don't make sense, right? But because the atmosphere in the US is so toxic, he cannot afford to be soft on China. And that's why we in Asia, and at the end of the day, I must emphasize, the total population of Asia is what? 4 billion, 4.5 billion people. We must speak out and explain to President Biden that please at least press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest, step back, and then take a look at the overall strategic picture and see where you go from here. And this brings me to the second point on how we can help Biden. I think it's important for us, when we speak to our American friends, publicly or privately, we need to explain to them the nature of our times. We are the 21st century clearly is going to be very different from the 20th century and the 19th century, right? In what ways is it different? It's different in two ways. One, for the last 200 years, the West could dominate the world. Frankly, what year is this now? 2021, okay? That's reverse 160 years and go back to whatever it is, 1841 and the Opium War, right? And I bring up the Opium War because that's how Hong Kong was created. And you could see that the Western powers could do anything with total impunity. They could do whatever they wanted, seize territories, colonize the world. do whatever they wanted to do, and nothing could stop them. But that was 160 years ago, or 170 years ago, actually. That world is gone, right? It's not going to come back anymore. So that's why they need to adjust and accept a new reality. And I say this because, one of the most pathetic sights in my mind was when the G7 leaders met recently and started making pronouncements on saying, China, you must do A, China, you must do B, China, you must do C. Excuse me. Who are these G7 countries? They represent the powers of the past. The total population is what, 750 million, right? Half of China's, same, maybe the same as Southeast Asia. Why should they arrogate upon themselves the right to pass judgments? That era when the West could do that is gone. And learn to live in a different era. And clearly what you're seeing now is the return of Asia. That's why the 21st century will be the Asian century. And within Asia, there's a very different dynamic that is taking place. And in the past, frankly, when I grew up as a child in the British colony in Singapore, clearly I had to learn about the West because the West was running the world. Now the time has come for the West to learn and understand Asia because the key economic drivers will come from Asia. And it's time for the West to learn to adjust to Asia. And Asian norms are very, very different from Western norms. And you want a good example of this, the Western countries will like to pass judgments on other countries and say your human rights standards are not good enough, you're making mistakes in A, B, C, D, and they could do that when they were very powerful. But the times have changed. And now, frankly, most Asian countries just won't accept lectures by the West. Every Asian country. I give you let's take even the example of India. Okay, India is a world's largest democracy, but India has been subject to lectures when India wanted to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. The European Union tried to impose human rights standards on India, and India said, excuse me, you don't pass judgment on what we in India are doing. We know best what's good for us. And within Asia too, frankly, one reason why Asia in general is at peace, and this is a very important point, because I've launched something called the Asian Peace Program. One reason why Asians is at peace is that we don't interfere in each other's internal affairs. And this principle, by the way, is actually surprisingly embedded in the UN Charter, is also embedded in the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, is embedded in the 1955 Bandung Principles. And we, therefore, have worked out a different dynamic for dealing with each other. It's not the Western dynamic, it's the Asian dynamic. And if the West is going to engage Asia, it's got to learn more about how Asian countries live and operate with each other. But when I say that we don't interfere with each other, it doesn't mean that the Asian countries are passive, that they're doing nothing. Actually, and this is a critical point, within Asia, we are building what I call circles of trust around Asia, and many of them are centered on ASEAN. You notice that it was the ASEAN countries that set up the dialogues with the great powers, set up the ASEAN Regional Forum, set up the East Asian Summit. And ironically, even though ASEAN is by far the weakest organization in some ways in Asia, it has been provided the foundations for the Asian countries to come together and learn to live and work and operate with each other. And these circles of trust, I want to emphasize this, have created concrete benefits for Asian countries. And Exhibit A, of course, is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, right? When all the Western writers write about the regional comprehensive economic partnership, they say, oh, this is a China-led trade agreement. That is absolutely untrue. Frankly, if China was the one to propose such a free trade agreement, a lot of China's neighbors, including some of his closest neighbors, Japan, South Korea, with whom, as you know, China has got, in its own way, difficult links, they would have said, no, 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 no. If China proposes it, I'm going to keep a distance. I'm not sure whether it's good for me. But ASEAN proposed it. And because ASEAN proposed it, and this is a very important point, because ASEAN had created circles of trust in the region, we would say, okay, if ASEAN proposes it, ASEAN doesn't mean to dominate the region. ASEAN wants to help the region. Okay, we'll sign. So everybody came on board. And many people have not noticed the really big deal of the regional comprehensive economic partnership. Because going back to my earlier point, the three biggest economies in East Asia are those of China, Japan, South Korea. If these three economies tried to sit down among themselves to negotiate a free trade agreement, it wouldn't have happened. There wasn't enough trust between these three countries. But because ASEAN proposed it, under the umbrella of ASEAN, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was signed. And then under that umbrella, China, Japan, and South Korea got a free trade agreement. So you can see that in its own quiet way, Asia is transforming the world, delivering remarkably positive new developments, but in an Asian way, not the Western way. And by the way, by contrast, incidentally, since the Europeans like to lecture the rest of the world, the European Union has now become, which is, by the way, still in many ways the most successful regional organization, become the first regional organization to break up with Brexit taken place. So in some ways, actually, there's ways in which the European Union can even learn lessons from ASEAN. And here, I want to add another important point, going back to my main theme about the US and its lack of strategy in managing China. I think one important reality that we need to convey to Washington, D.C. is that if the goal of Trump's trade war, we don't know, because as I said earlier, the goals have never been specified. Let me emphasize that. If the goal of the Trump administration with the trade war was to decouple the US and China economies, and if that goal is still being maintained by the Biden administration, the danger is that the United States won't just decouple from China, it will decouple from all of East Asia, which is going to become connected by the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And so paradoxically, the friends of the United States, like, for example, Japan and Australia, if they really want the United States to stay in East Asia, then Japan and Australia should be the first two countries to say to the United States, don't decouple from China. Because if you decouple from China, you leave the region, goodbye, United States, you're not part of the game. Because the big game is economic. And this brings me to my third point about how we help the Biden administration. And here, the key point that we need to make to the United States is that this is not the Cold War against the Soviet Union. This, in the contest between United States and China, will not be determined by the economic, it will not be determined in the military dimension. It'll be determined in the economic dimension. So why is that an important point? Quite simply, this is why this is important. The United States has by far the world's largest defense budget. I don't know the figure now, $750 billion, larger than the next 10 countries combined. In fact, there's a column written by Farid Zakaria recently in the Washington Post explaining how much money is being wasted in the US defense budget. So if the competition with the Soviet Union, the military dimension was important, fine, spend a lot of money in defense, because that's where the contest was. But in the case of China, the competition is going to be in the economic dimension. And paradoxically, a very large US defense budget, which is very wasteful, is in some ways a geopolitical gift to China, because American money is being wasted unnecessarily. And, Farid Zakaria gave a concrete example of how it's wasted. He said that the United States spent $1.7 trillion, this is trillion dollars, trying to build the F-35, the world's most advanced jet fighter, which functionally will become a white elephant because it's too good to be used. And China, by contrast, has spent $1.7 trillion on the Belt and Road Initiative, building roads, ports, highways, hospitals, everything around the world. And you can look at this and say, what's a more intelligent way of spending your money, right? Clearly is using it for the Belt and Road Initiative. But that's also a larger part of why America should pay attention to its economy and not its military in the contest against China. And here, the tragedy about the United States is that the United States today, one reason why it is such an unhappy country is that it is the only modern developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And of course, all this is documented in my book, Has China Won? Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate, has also written another book on it. And so this is actually, surprisingly, paradoxically, if the United States wants to win the contest against China, the first thing it needs to do is to lift up the bottom 50% of its population. And why is that important? Well, why that is important is because one of America's, America has produced two great strategic thinkers after World War II. One is Henry Kissinger, I mentioned him already. The other is George Kennan, who passed. I met him once, actually. He passed away 20 years ago or so. No, he was alive in the Iraq War, no, post the Iraq War, sorry. George Kennan said something very important. Now, most Americans remember him as the strategies behind the containment policy of the Soviet Union. It's true, he advocated it. But he also said something else, which is far more important. And I'm going to read to you a quote from him, if you don't mind. He said, and this he said, the outcome of the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union would depend on its ability to, quote, create among the peoples of the world generally the impression of a country which knows what it wants, which is coping successfully with the problems of its internal life and with the responsibilities of a world power, and which has a spiritual vitality capable of holding its own among the major ideological currents of the time, unquote. There are four limbs to his statement. Coping successfully with internal problems. Now you see, internal problems, it's your bottom 50%. If you don't take care of your bottom 50%, you're losing the competition. So America should first focus on helping its own people, because that is what's going to make America the most successful and attractive society in the world. And as he says, cope with global responsibilities. And the United States under Trump, as you know, walked away from many global responsibilities like climate change. And the last point he made was that which has a spiritual vitality. And this is what, frankly, is missing in the United States today. Because, I mean, for those of us who have been visiting or have good friends in America and have been going to America, I first went there in 1973, I think, 74. Uh, and the United States as a country was rising, rising, rising for several decades. And if you look at the conditions of the bottom 50%, it's been stagnant or going down for the last 30 years. So that's the priority of what United States should be focused on, and that's what Biden should be doing. And this brings me to the another paradox. You can see I like paradoxes. If the goal of Joe Biden was to help improve the livelihood of the bottom 50% and develop better infrastructure, uh, a better quality of life for the people of America, he should look around for economic partners around the world. And the best economic partner to help improve the livelihood of the bottom 50%, not surprisingly, is China. Because China has now the world's biggest market in some ways, you know. And a friend of mine gave me this statistic, which illustrates how the relative standing of the internal markets of US and China have changed. In the year 2009, about 12 years ago, the size of the retail goods market in China was $1.8 trillion, and United States was $4 trillion, more than double that of China 10 years ago, 12 years ago. You fast forward to the year 2019, and 2019 is a significant year because this is 3 years after Trump's trade war, when he was trying to beat down the Chinese economy. The result was that the retail goods market in China went from $1.8 trillion to $6 trillion, increase of more than 3 times. And United States only went from 4 trillion to 5.5 trillion, an increase of less than 1.5 times. And 10 years from now, there's no question that the retail goods market in China will be much bigger. And if you want to grow your enterprises, if you want to grow your economy, you engage other growing economies in the world, and therefore you engage China. And so this is at the end of the day, if you are trying to help Biden, and if you are trying to help Biden to do well in the United States so that he succeeds, he's got to actually find ways and means of cooperating with China, which of course in the end of the day, as I go back to my earlier point, it's impossible to make that point in the United States. But we in Asia, we can say it, and we should say it to Joe Biden. So one thing we should emphasize, therefore, is that we should tell him the nature of the competition in East Asia means that you just forget about the Quad. The Quad, as you know, is an alliance of United States, Japan, Australia, India. It's all very defense-oriented alliance, no economic cooperation among these 4 countries at all. But instead of focusing on the Quad, what Joe Biden should try to do is rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we actually, many in East Asia, have kept alive. You know, the TPP should have died when Trump administration withdrew from it. But all of us who wanted to get the United States to remain in the region, we kept the TPP alive. And so the United States should rejoin the TPP. That's what the nature of the competition is like. And that's what we should be asking Joe Biden to do. So you can see that all the points I'm making are actually intended to help the Biden administration, help the United States. But all the points I'm making to you now are points you cannot make in Washington, D.C., because you'll be shot for suggesting anything that suggests even any kind of cooperation with China, even when it's in America's interest to do so. So therefore, let me conclude now, because I realize I've exceeded my 30 limits now. To conclude, I would say that what the US therefore should do, and let me quickly just conclude with these 3 points to repeat what I said at the beginning. Just for a start, just press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest. And then the second step is step back and work out a strategy. And here, now the second point on working out a strategy, I hope that the United States will explore what the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, said: support the rules-based order. Okay. Now, he said rules-based order, right? Anthony Blinken? Fine. get any American university, doesn't matter which one, to do an objective evaluation. Which country, United States or China, abides by the rules-based order? I won't say anything now. But as Mr. Tung said, I was ambassador to the UN for 10 years. I'm a passionate believer